Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at,
Oh, this is going to be good.
so we're going to be cracking open Stieg Larsson's Millennium Trilogy.
Oh, yeah.
With Lisbeth Salander.
Yes, Lisbeth Salander. I'm excited.
We'll be using The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo and Philosophy along with, the books themselves.
Of course.
To kind of help us understand her.
I love that book.
Yeah.
It's so interesting.
Yeah. It's going to be kind of a wild ride through philosophy and ethics and...
Absolutely. Yeah, Larsson really knew how to weave those big questions into a gripping story.
Yeah, he did. Okay, so let's just dive right in. Lisbeth Salander, she's a hacker, a survivor.
Yeah.
She gets hit with a lot of labels in the books, doesn't she?
She does.
Psychotic nutcase.
Oh, yeah.
Lesbian Satanist.
And those are just the tip of the iceberg.
Right, and that's where the whole idea of stigma comes in. Irving Goffman, in Asylums, argues that labels, especially the negative ones, can really reduce a person's entire identity to just that label.
It's like they become that label and nothing else, right?
It's like in The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, when they're building a case against her.
Yeah.
They focus on her psychiatric history, implying that she's unstable and dangerous.
Exactly.
They totally overlook her actual abilities.
They completely miss all the nuances.
Yeah.
And the book really dives into how those assumptions about promiscuity and violence, how they just get attached to the label of mental illness.
Yeah. It makes you wonder, how often do labels limit someone's potential, even if those labels are...
Oh, all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. We do it all the time, even without realizing it.
Yeah, we do. It's like they become a self-fulfilling prophecy.
It is.
Which brings us to Lisbeth's school experience.
Oh, yeah.
The source connects this to Michel Foucault's ideas on how institutions use their power to control and categorize individuals.
Oh, Foucault. Yes, he talked about how schools, for instance, use systems of knowledge and power to, cut people into these categories.
And they base it on things like standardized tests.
And those categories, even though they seem objective, they often reinforce existing power structures.
Right. And it makes you think about Lisbeth's, she's brilliant with math.
She is.
She solved a Rubik's Cube in under an hour.
That's incredible.
This is a mind that can crack complex codes.
Right.
But she's labeled as at risk.
It's amazing, isn't it?
Right. And she struggles in a traditional school environment.
It's almost like the system punishes those who don't fit the mold.
Right. And it makes you wonder, are we missing out on some unconventional brilliance?
I think so.
Because they don't fit in the, the boxes.
Right. It's like we value conformity over genuine talent and creativity.
Right. What do you think? Does the system sometimes miss those who don't fit the mold?
Absolutely. I think it happens all the time. We need to find ways to recognize and nurture those unique abilities.
Yeah, nurture them. Right.
Yeah. And this idea of not fitting the mold goes beyond academics.
Right.
Think about Lisbeth's rejection of traditional gender norms, too.
Right. You see this in her androgynous style, her tattoos, her choice to work in,
a male-dominated field.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
She doesn't fit into those boxes that society tries to put her in.
It's like she's actively rejecting those labels.
Right. And the source even uses the term
genderqueer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To describe her.
Which is really fitting when you think about it.
It is. And she's always disrupting the expectations of, everyone around her. Her boss, Dragan Armansky.
Yeah.
Even the reader.
Right. It's like she's making us confront our own assumptions about gender and identity.
It's like Judith Butler's idea of gender as a performance.
Yes, exactly. It's a performance that Lisbeth refuses to play along with.
Right. So how do you think challenging gender expectations like Lisbeth does disrupts things, maybe even changes the balance of power?
Well, I think it definitely forces us to question the categories we use to define ourselves and others. And when you start questioning those categories, you start to see the cracks in the system. You start to see how those categories can be used to control people.
Right. Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit and talk about our other main player, Michael Blomqvist.
Okay.
The book dives into some interesting territory with his relationships and the ethics surrounding them.
Yeah, it brings up some really contrasting philosophical views.
Right, like Immanuel Kant's ideas on, objectification in casual relationships.
Right, the whole idea of treating people as means to an end rather than ends in themselves.
Right, versus Irving Singer's more positive perspective on sexual desire.
Oh, yeah.
As a way to
connect with another person.
Yeah, right. And you see this play out in how Blomkvist navigates his relationships with Erica Berger, Cecilia Vanger, and eventually Lisbeth.
Right.
Each one of them raises questions about consent, power dynamics, emotional complexities.
And the book doesn't shy away from analyzing Blomkvist's commitment issues.
Right.
His anxieties about power imbalances.
Right, right. Do you think he is struggling with some ethical dilemmas?
I think he is. Right. I mean, he clearly wants to be a good person.
Yeah.
But he also has these desires, these needs.
Yeah.
And he's trying to find a balance, right? But sometimes I'm not sure he gets it right.
Yeah, sometimes it makes you really question what he's doing.
Yeah.
All right, so we've talked about...
Switching gears again. We've got to talk about the coffee.
Okay.
I mean, Blomkvist practically lives on this stuff.
I know he does.
But the source, actually, it turns this seemingly mundane detail into a fascinating exploration of coffees.
I know, I thought that was so...
Isn't it?
It's interesting.
It's great.
Yeah.
So we're going back to 17th century Europe.
Okay.
Where coffee houses were like these hubs of intellectual discussion and debate.
I love that. They called it, what was it? The drink that...
Oh, yeah. The drink that would lead apes in hell.
I love that.
Can you imagine? I mean, it's like our everyday latte was once considered seriously scandalous.
Oh, it's wild. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And then they contrast that with the Japanese tea ceremony.
Right. A totally different vibe. More contemplative, focused on the dream of evanescence.
Right.
It really highlights how different beverages can evoke such different cultural and philosophical associations.
Yeah. What do you think? Does your go-to drink say something about your approach to life?
Ooh, that's a good question. Maybe we should all pay more attention to
I know, right?
What we're sipping on.
Right, exactly. But getting back to Blomkvist.
Okay.
The book digs into his role as a journalist, especially a crime journalist.
Yeah.
In the context of Swedish society.
Right. And it makes this really interesting parallel between Blomkvist
and Jan Guillou, who was this real-life journalist who exposed government secrets.
Right. And faced some pretty serious consequences.
Yeah. It's a reminder that chasing the truth can be dangerous.
Yeah, it is. And the book kind of charts how crime journalism in Sweden has changed over time. From its more
radical roots in the 70s.
To the more sensationalist trends that we see today.
Definitely a shift towards, spectacle over substance.
Right. Do you think that reflects a broader societal shift?
It might. I mean, there's definitely a growing anxiety about crime, and the media plays a huge role in shaping those perceptions.
Right. The source uses the example of the over-reporting of youth crime.
Oh, yeah. A classic example of how media narratives can distort reality.
Right. It created this perception that there was just widespread delinquency, even though the statistics didn't back it up.
It creates a climate of fear, even if it's not grounded in reality.
Right. Right. So in a world of clickbait headlines and 24/47 news cycles, how do we sift through it all and find the truth?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean, we have access to more information than ever before.
Yeah.
But it's also harder than ever to know what to trust.
Right. It's a challenge for sure.
It is.
Okay. So speaking of challenges, let's jump into the world of hacking.
Okay.
The source brings up Julian Assange and WikiLeaks as...
Oh, yeah. Interesting comparison.
Parallel to Lisbeth's actions.
Yeah.
And they both make us kind of rethink our assumptions about hackers, don't they?
They do. I mean, the stereotypical image of a hacker is this, lone wolf criminal lurking in the shadows.
Right.
But the reality is much more complex. There's this whole hacker ethic that emphasizes creativity, problem solving, and free access to information.
Right. And the source breaks down that hacker ethic into these principles like freedom of information, distrust of authority, and using technology for good.
Yeah, it's about pushing boundaries, challenging the status quo. And Lisbeth definitely embodies that spirit.
Yeah, she does. Especially her focus on sharing information and her distrust of authority.
Absolutely. But she also blurs the lines.
She does.
Their vigilante justice.
Right. Where do we draw the ethical boundaries?
That's a tough one. I mean, on one hand, you can argue that hacking can be a form of activism.
Yeah.
A way to expose wrongdoing and hold the powerful accountable. But on the other hand, it's still illegal.
Right.
And it can have unintended consequences.
Right.
It's a really complex issue.
Yeah.
With no easy answers.
It is. Okay.
We've got to talk about the section.
Right.
I mean, that's one of the most chilling parts of the book, isn't it?
Right.
This shadowy group within the Swedish security service.
Right.
And the source uses Rousseau's ideas about how institutions,
right,
they can become more powerful than the people they're supposed to represent.
Yeah.
Right?
And the section is like the perfect example.
It's a classic tale of how power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts, absolutely.
Right, and they use the section to show how unchecked power can lead to
all sorts of
pretty terrifying situations.
Abuses.
Right.
Cover-ups, manipulation, violence.
Yeah. And it's not just the section. Think about how various institutions fail, Lisbeth. The police, the courts, the psychiatric hospital.
The guardianship agency. It's a whole system that seems designed to silence her, to control her.
Right. It makes you wonder, how do we protect ourselves when those systems become...
It's a scary thought, isn't it?
It is scary. Okay, so let's
talk about gossip. I mean, it's everywhere in this book.
It is.
It's so relevant to today's world.
It is.
With social media, we're constantly bombarded with information.
Right.
But so much of it is unverified, right? Rumors, speculation, half-truth.
Right.
And the book shows how easily that can be manipulated to control the narrative.
Right. Like when those anonymous sources try to take down Millennium Magazine by spreading rumors.
It's a classic smear campaign.
Yeah.
Using gossip as a weapon.
Yeah. It makes you think about the responsibility.
Oh, absolutely.
You all have.
We all have a role to play in this. I mean, we can't just blindly believe everything we read online.
Right.
We have to be critical. We have to ask questions. We have to consider the source.
Yeah. How do we even determine what's true?
Right. It's a constant battle, for sure.
It is a constant battle. But the book also reminds us that gossip can be used for good.
Right. It can.
Well,
it can be a way to expose corruption, challenge those in power, give a voice to the voiceless.
Right. The source even makes this like fascinating parallel between Lisbeth's hacking and how marginalized groups have used gossip and rumor mongering throughout history as a form of
resistance. Resistance.
Absolutely. When you don't have access to official channels, gossip becomes a way to fight back, to spread information, to build solidarity.
So Lisbeth, in a way, is carrying on that tradition.
She is. She's using her skills to disrupt the dominant narrative to expose the truth. Okay, now let's dive into one of the most ethically challenging themes, revenge. Especially Lisbeth's brutal retaliation against her guardian, Nils Buurman.
Oh yeah, that scene is intense.
It is intense, and it makes you both cringe and kind of cheer at the same time.
I know. It's hard to know how to feel about it.
It is. The source frames this discussion around Aristotle's concept of catharsis.
Right. The idea that revenge can provide this sense of emotional release.
Right. So for Elizabeth, maybe that was a way to, you know, reclaim her power, break free from the trauma of
the abuse.
Yeah. But is that enough to justify her actions?
That's a tough question.
Yeah.
I mean, on one hand, you can understand her anger, her need for retribution.
Right. Is there ever a point where seeking retribution crosses the line? What do you think?
I don't know. It's hard to say. I mean, I think it depends on the situation, on the context, but I do think it's something we need to be really careful about.
Yeah.
Because revenge, it can be so seductive, so...
satisfying in the moment.
Right.
But it can also lead to more violence, more pain, more suffering. It can perpetuate a cycle that's hard to break free from.
Right. And the source also brings in Immanuel Kant's perspective.
Oh, right. Kant would have a very different take on this.
Right. And Kant believed that, you know, ethical actions should come from a sense of duty, a moral obligation.
Right, not from personal desires like revenge.
Right. So even if we think Buurman deserved punishment, Lisbeth taking the law into her own hands, from Kant's perspective...
it would be seen as a violation of a universal moral principle.
Right.
Right. You can't justify breaking the rules just because you feel like it's the right thing to do in a particular situation.
Right.
Yeah. There has to be a higher principle guiding your actions.
Right. So two very different perspectives on a really complex issue. It makes you realize how many layers there are to this story.
It's not just a simple thriller. It's a book that makes you think, that challenges your assumptions about justice, morality, the whole
shebang. You know, it's interesting how Lisbeth, even though she's this, you know, tech whiz and a survivor, she still operates with her own kind of moral code, right?
Yeah, she's definitely not afraid to break the rules.
No.
But you can always sense that there's a sense of justice driving her.
Right, even if her methods are a little...
unconventional.
Yeah, a little rough around the edges.
Right.
The source brings up Kant's categorical imperative.
Oh, right.
Which is basically about acting in a way that could be a universal rule,
Right.
Like, could everyone do what you're doing without society falling apart?
Right, right.
So it makes you wonder, do Elizabeth's actions pass that test?
Oh, that's a tough one.
It is.
Because on one hand, she's often driven by self-preservation, right?
Right.
And a desire for revenge.
Yeah, not exactly universal moral principles there.
Right. But on the other hand, she's fiercely protective of the vulnerable, especially women who've been abused.
Right.
Like, she has this deep sense of empathy for those who've been wronged.
She does.
And that protective instinct, it's tied to her distrust of institutions, isn't it?
It is. I mean, she's seen firsthand how systems can be corrupted.
Right.
How those in power can manipulate and exploit others.
Yeah. Remember her experiences with corrupt authorities?
Oh, yeah.
I mean,
those scenes are chilling.
They are. And it's like she's seen those cracks in the system.
Right.
And those ways it can fail.
To protect the innocent.
Yeah. So she decides to become this sort of vigilante.
Right. She's taking justice into her own hands.
Right. And deliver her own brand of justice.
Which raises some serious ethical questions.
Yeah.
I mean, we might cheer for her when she takes down a truly despicable person.
Right.
But her methods, they're brutal and definitely outside the law.
Right. Do you wrestle with those moral complexities as you're reading?
Oh, absolutely. All the time. Yeah. It's like you want to root for her.
Yeah.
But you also know that what she's doing is...
Yeah.
Well, it's wrong.
Right. It makes you question your own sense of right and wrong.
It really does. It's like, where do you draw the line?
Yeah.
When is it okay to break the rules? When does the end justify the means?
Right. And that's what makes the book so thought-provoking, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's not giving you easy answers.
Yeah.
It's forcing you to confront these uncomfortable truths about power and justice and what we're willing to accept in the name of a greater good.
Right. Exactly. Okay, speaking of things that make you think.
Can we go back to the coffee for a second?
I was hoping you would bring that up.
I know, right? It's such a small detail, but the source makes this argument that it plays a pretty significant role.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting.
Right.
Yeah.
It's more than just a caffeine fix for Blomfist. It's like coffee symbolizes this commitment to rationality.
Oh, yeah.
Intellectual curiosity, the pursuit of truth.
Right. I mean, coffee fuels their investigations.
It's
their drive to uncover the truth.
And it's such a contrast with the way alcohol is portrayed in the book.
Right.
Often leading to darker impulses and compromises.
Right. Like it's this conscious...
Yeah, coffee's like this symbol of being present, engaged, clear-headed.
Yeah. Alcohol's
like the escape.
Yeah. It's...
the blurring of the lines.
Yeah. Okay, so we talked about gossip earlier. It's such a big part of this book.
Oh, yeah. It's everywhere. And it's so relevant to today's world.
Yeah.
I mean, with social media, we're drowning in information.
Right.
But so much of it is unverified.
Right.
Rumors, gossip, speculation, all masquerading as facts.
Yeah. Those anonymous sources trying to take down Millennium Magazine by spreading rumors.
Right, exactly. It's a reminder that gossip can be weaponized.
Yeah.
Especially online.
It makes you think about the responsibility we all have.
Oh, absolutely.
To be critical of what we see and read online.
We can't just blindly accept everything that pops up in our feed.
How do we avoid becoming part of the problem?
It's tough.
Yeah.
I mean, it takes effort. It takes critical thinking skills.
Yeah.
But it's so important.
Right. But the book reminds us that gossip can be used for good, too.
It can.
Yeah.
It can be a way to challenge those in power, to hold them accountable, to expose corruption.
Right. It can be a way to give voice to the voiceless.
Exactly. It all depends on how it's used, right? On the intentions behind it.
Right. Okay, let's get back to the section. It's a chilling example.
It's like a cautionary tale about unchecked power.
Yeah, about how systems designed to protect us can become...
instruments of oppression.
Right. And the book doesn't hold back, No,
it's brutal. It shows the dark side of bureaucracy, the ways in which power can corrupt even the best intentions.
Right. And it's not limited to this section.
No, it's everywhere. The police, the courts, the psychiatric system, the guardianship agency.
It makes you realize that no institution is immune to corruption.
It's a sobering thought.
Yeah.
And it raises the question, how do we hold these institutions accountable?
Right.
How do we prevent abuse of power? How do we ensure that systems designed to serve the public actually do that?
Yeah. That's a challenge societies have been wrestling with for centuries.
Yeah, it's a constant struggle.
It's a reminder that we can't just sit back and trust that institutions will always act in our best interest.
No, we have to be vigilant. We have to be informed.
Right.
We have to be willing to speak out against injustice.
And that brings us back to Lisbeth, right?
Yeah.
I mean, she's someone who refuses to be silenced.
She's a fighter. She's using her skills to fight back against corruption, injustice, even if it means going outside the law.
Right. It's a complex and morally ambiguous position she occupies.
It is. On the one hand, she's a hero. She's exposing wrongdoing. She's fighting for the vulnerable.
Right.
But on the other hand, she's a vigilante. She's a hacker. She's breaking the law.
Right. It makes you wonder about the ethics of hacking, right?
It does. The source explores the hacker ethic.
Right.
Which emphasizes this freedom of information, the use of technology for good.
Right.
But where do we draw the line?
Yeah.
When does hacking cross over from being this, ethical activism to criminal activity?
Right. It's a debate that's becoming even more heated.
Oh, yeah, especially with all the data breaches we're seeing.
Right, right. And government surveillance.
Right.
And the power of these tech giants.
It's a really important question to be asking.
Yeah, it is. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit and talk about gender and sexuality in the Millennium Trilogy.
Okay.
One thing that stands out is Lisbeth's rejection of traditional gender roles, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. I mean, her style, her piercings, her tattoos,
right,
her choice of career.
Right.
It's all a direct challenge to those societal expectations of how women should look and behave.
It is. It's refreshing to see a female character who's so unapologetically herself.
I know. It's like she's saying, I'm not going to play by your rules. I'm going to be who I am.
Right.
And I think that's really powerful.
It is. And the book goes beyond just her appearance.
It does.
It explores female sexuality and desire in a way that feels honest and complex.
Yes. It's not shying away from those conversations.
Right.
And it's treating Lisbeth's experience as both positive and negative with respect.
You're right. I mean, you see it in her experiences with sexual violence, her exploration of her bisexuality.
Her relationship with Blancfist.
Right.
Which is complicated.
Very complicated.
Yeah. She's a fully realized person.
It is.
With agency and desire.
And it's a far cry from those stereotypical female characters you often see in crime fiction.
Right, exactly.
The damsels in distress or the femme fatales.
Yeah.
Lisbeth's none of those things. She's a force to be reckoned with.
Yeah, she is. And she doesn't let anyone dictate who she is or how she should express herself.
Right.
And the source connects her to this broader discussion about gender fluidity.
Yes. It's like she's embodying this idea that gender is a performance, and she's refusing to play along.
Yeah.
She's disrupting those expectations, forcing everyone around her to confront their own assumptions about what it means to be a man or a woman.
She is a disruptor, a catalyst for change. Yeah. And her impact goes beyond just challenging gender norms.
Right. She's exposing hypocrisy and corruption.
Right. Wherever she finds it.
Right. Exactly.
Whether it's in government, in business, in personal relationships.
Right. It's like she's this embodiment of radical truth-telling.
She is.
And she doesn't care who she offends or what rules she breaks.
She's not playing by anyone's rules but her own.
Right. Exactly.
And I think that's part of what makes her so appealing.
Yeah, I agree.
She's not perfect.
Yeah.
She's messy. She's complicated. But she's always true to herself.
Yeah. But she's not the only one who undergoes a transformation in the book, right?
Yeah, Blomqvist does too.
Yeah. Blomqvist, despite his progressive values, still has to confront his own biases and assumptions.
He does. You see it in his relationships with women.
Yeah.
Even though he considers himself a feminist,
right,
he still struggles with those traditional ideas about masculinity and power dynamics.
Right.
And the source uses his relationships as a case study to explore the ethics of casual relationships.
It does. It makes you think about consent, power imbalances.
The emotional complexities of intimacy.
Right.
In a world where those traditional relationship structures are constantly changing.
Right. It's a reminder that even those of us who consider ourselves enlightened can still harbor unconscious biases.
Absolutely.
And make mistakes.
They're all works in progress.
Right. Exactly.
And personal growth is an ongoing journey.
Right. And that journey, that process of confronting your flaws and striving to be better is a central theme in the book, isn't it?
It is. Both Lisbeth and Blomqvist, they're trying to overcome their past traumas.
Right.
To become more whole.
Right.
To live more authentically.
Right. And that message of resilience and hope resonates so deeply with readers.
It does. It's like, even in the face of adversity, even when things are really dark, there's always the possibility of healing, of growth, of finding your own kind of triumph.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so speaking of triumph, let's revisit that connection the source makes between coffee.
Oh, yes.
And a certain mindset.
Right. How coffee represents this dedication to rationality, to critical thinking, to the pursuit of truth.
Exactly. It fuels that quest for knowledge and justice.
Right. And it's such a contrast with alcohol, which often leads Bluntfist down a path of,
darkness and compromise.
Exactly.
The source even ties that symbolism back to those early coffee houses,
I know.
Those hubs of intellectual activity during the Enlightenment.
Remember how some people called coffee the drink that would lead apes in hell?
I love that.
Amazing, right?
I mean, our everyday latte was once considered so radical.
I know. It just goes to show how our perceptions, even of something as simple as a drink, can evolve over time.
Yeah. What do you think? Does your choice of beverage say something about your approach to life?
Ooh, that's a good one. Maybe we should all be a little more mindful of what we're drinking.
I know, right?
Okay. But speaking of brewing, let's get back to journalism for a second.
Okay.
And how it shapes public perception, especially when it comes to crime. Yeah. The book traces this evolution of crime journalism in Sweden.
Right.
And it shows how societal anxieties, political agendas, all of that can influence the way crime is reported.
Right.
And how those media narratives can actually distort reality.
Right.
They can fuel fear, even when the facts don't support it.
Yeah. Remember the example the source gives about the over-reporting of youth crime?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Creating this panic about juvenile delinquency.
Right, even though the actual statistics
didn't back it up at all.
Right. So it's like we need to be really critical consumers of news, especially today.
Absolutely. I mean, with the 24-hour news cycle and social media,
yeah,
it's so easy to get swept up in the hype.
Right. So how do we do that? How do we become those critical consumers?
Well, I think it starts with being aware of our own biases.
Okay.
What are our preconceived notions about crime?
Right.
About certain groups of people?
Right. And then I guess we have to be willing to seek out different perspectives.
Yes. Don't just rely on one source of information. Read different newspapers, different websites.
Yeah, okay.
Listen to different podcasts. Get a variety of viewpoints.
Yeah, okay.
And then be willing to question those narratives that seem too simple or too sensational.
Right.
If something sounds too good to be true, it probably is.
Right. It's a challenge.
It is. It's a lot of work.
Yeah.
But it's so important.
It is important. Okay, speaking of engaging in discussion, let's revisit that hacker ethic.
Oh, yeah. That's a fascinating concept.
Yeah.
The source makes this contrast between that popular image of hackers,
right,
as criminals, as these...
Right, the villains.
Yeah, the villains, the shadowy figures.
Yeah.
Versus the self-defined ethos of the hacker community.
Right, right. Which emphasizes things like creativity and problem solving and open access to information.
Right. It's about pushing boundaries, challenging the status quo, exploring the limits of what's possible with technology.
Right.
And Lisbeth, she definitely embodies some of that.
Yeah.
But she also blurs the lines. Right. With her vigilante justice. So it raises this question. Where do we draw the line between ethical hacking and criminal activity?
Yeah. It's a debate that's become even more heated, hasn't it?
It has.
Yeah.
Especially with all the data breaches and government surveillance.
Right.
The stakes are getting higher.
Yeah.
And it's a question that we're all going to have to grapple with.
Right. The book doesn't offer easy answers, but it does make us think.
It does. It forces us to confront the complexities of this issue.
Yeah.
And to consider the ethical implications of our own online behavior.
Okay, so speaking of consequences.
Back to the section.
Let's circle back to this section.
Yeah, and the dangers of unchecked power within institutions.
Right.
The book really drives home this point. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Right. And the section, it's like a prime example.
Oh, absolutely. Those chilling examples of abuse, of corruption.
Yeah.
They're a stark reminder that no institution is immune to the temptations of power. And it's not just government agencies. We see it in the police force, the courts, the psychiatric system, even the guardianship agency.
Right. It paints a pretty bleak picture.
It does.
Of a society where those impositions of authority can exploit that power for personal gain.
Right, and where the systems that are supposed to protect the vulnerable can become instruments of oppression.
Yeah, and it's a reminder that we can't just trust those in power to always act in our best interests.
Right. We have to be vigilant. We have to be informed. We have to be willing to hold those in authority accountable for their actions.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the power of gossip.
Oh, yeah. Gossip. That double-edged sword.
Right.
capable of both great harm and great good.
Right.
The book explores that so brilliantly.
It does.
Showing how it can be used to spread lies, to ruin reputations, to silence dissent,
Right.
but also how it can be used to challenge those dominant narratives.
Right. To expose corruption.
Yes.
To give a voice to those who are marginalized.
And I think that's one of the most fascinating aspects of the book, how it takes this thing that we often dismiss as frivolous or even malicious,
right,
and shows how it can be this incredibly powerful force for both good and evil.
Right. Remember the example of those anonymous sources spreading rumors to try to destroy Millennium magazine?
Oh, yeah, a classic example of how gossip can be weaponized.
Right, especially in the age of social media,
Exactly.
where information spreads so quickly.
And it's so hard to control.
Right. So it's a reminder that we need to be incredibly careful about what we believe and what we share.
Absolutely. We have a responsibility to be discerning consumers of information.
Yeah.
To think critically about the sources we trust and the narratives that we're buying into.
Right. And the book also makes this connection, this parallel between Lisbeth's hacking.
Oh, yeah. I love that part.
And the historical use of gossip and rumor mongering as forms of resistance.
Right.
Yeah.
By marginalized groups who didn't have access to those official channels of communication.
Right.
They used gossip as a way to fight back, to challenge those in power,
right,
to spread information that might otherwise be suppressed.
Yeah. So Lisbeth, in a sense, is carrying on that tradition.
She is. She's a digital whisperer.
Right. She's
using her skills to disrupt those dominant narratives, to expose the truth.
Okay, so finally, let's revisit that theme of revenge.
Oh, yeah. That's a tough one.
Yeah. The source presents those two contrasting philosophical perspectives.
Right, Aristotle and Kant.
Right. Aristotle's idea that revenge can lead to catharsis, that emotional release.
Right, that feeling of justice being served.
Right. And then Kant's belief that ethical action should come from this sense of duty, a moral obligation.
Not from personal desires, like revenge.
Right, exactly. And the book doesn't give us easy answers.
No, it doesn't. It leaves us wrestling with those questions.
Yeah.
About the nature of justice, the motivations behind our actions, whether revenge ever truly brings closure.
Yeah. Lisbeth's actions, they're both horrifying and strangely satisfying.
I know, right? It's like, on one hand, you can understand her rage, her need to retaliate.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, you know that what she's doing is wrong.
Right. But it's a question that stays with you, you know?
It does, long after you finish the book.
Yeah.
And I think that's a testament to Larson's skill as a writer.
Right. To be able to weave those complex philosophical questions into such a gripping narrative.
He really makes you think. And as we move into the final part of the book, keep those questions in mind. How do these themes of power, justice, individual freedom continue to play out?
Right.
How does Larson use his characters to challenge our assumptions about the world?
Right. So many questions.
So many questions. And hopefully some answers. We'll see.
We've been talking a lot about the thought-provoking themes in Stieg Larsson's Millennium Trilogy, but there's one scene that really sticks with you, Lisbeth's revenge on her guardian Nils Bierman.
Yeah, it's a moment that definitely gets people talking.
It does. On the one hand, it's a brutal act of violence, but on the other hand, there's this sense of twisted satisfaction seeing her reclaim her power after everything she endured.
It's complicated.
Yeah.
I mean, on the one hand, you have this brutal act, but on the other hand, you have this woman who's been so systematically abused, and she's finally taking control.
Right.
It's hard not to feel a sense of, vindication, even if her methods are extreme.
Right. The source brings up Aristotle's idea of catharsis.
Oh, yeah.
The idea that revenge can provide this sense of emotional release.
Right.
So do you think that applies here? Was this a way for Lisbeth to kind of purge the trauma, the anger, the helplessness she felt?
It's possible. Aristotle argued that when you retaliate against someone who has wronged you, it can replace the pain of resentment with this feeling of justice being served.
Right.
So for Lisbeth, maybe that act of revenge was a way to finally break free from the trauma of Bierman's abuse.
But the source also points out that this satisfaction can be complicated, right? It involves reliving the original pain. Making the perpetrator experience a measure of the suffering they inflicted.
It's not a clean break from the past.
It's not. And it raises the question of whether revenge truly heals or just perpetuates a cycle of violence and trauma.
Right.
It's a question the book kind of leaves open.
Yeah, it definitely doesn't give you easy answers.
It doesn't. And one that I'm still kind of wrestling with.
It sticks with you.
Yeah.
It makes you think about your own values, your own boundaries.
Right. But it's interesting to consider how different philosophical perspectives might view Lisbeth's actions.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, we talked about Aristotle, but what about Kant? He had some pretty strong opinions about morality and ethical behavior.
Oh, yeah. Kant would definitely have some thoughts on this.
So Kant believed that our actions should be guided by a sense of duty and these universal moral principles.
Right, not just personal desires.
Right, not just revenge.
Exactly.
So for Kant, it's about the intent behind the action.
Right, not just the outcome.
Not just the outcome. So even if we think Bjorman deserved punishment, Lisbeth taking the law into her own hands, from Kant's perspective, that goes against a higher moral code.
Right, it would be seen as a violation of a universal moral principle.
Right, so it really highlights that tension between seeking personal justice and upholding a universal moral standard.
It's a classic philosophical dilemma. Do you prioritize the individual or the universal? The needs of the one versus the needs of the many.
Right, exactly. And the book doesn't shy away from those tough questions.
It doesn't. And that's one of the things that makes it so compelling.
Right, you're constantly forced to think.
To re-examine your own beliefs.
Right. There's no easy answers.
No.
No clear right or wrong.
It's all shades of gray.
Okay, speaking of navigating ethical gray areas.
Let's talk about hacking.
The book dives deep into the world of hacking, and Lisbeth, of course, is a master of this domain.
She is.
She uses her skills to expose secrets, fight corruption, right wrongs. But her methods, they often push the boundaries.
They do. It's like she's operating in this liminal space.
Right, she walks this fine line, right?
She does.
The source explores that concept of the hacker ethic.
Oh, yeah.
Which emphasizes freedom of information transparency, using technology for social good. But Lisbeth also engages in activities that are undeniably illegal.
It's a blurry line, isn't it? When does hacking cross over from ethical activism to criminal activity?
It's a question that's more relevant now than ever, I think.
Oh, absolutely. With data breaches, online privacy concerns, the growing influence of these tech giants.
Right. The book doesn't offer a simple solution, but it does force us to confront those complexities.
It does. It makes us think about our own roles.
Right. To consider the ethical implications of our own actions online.
It's a reminder that even those seemingly harmless things we do online can have real-world consequences.
Right, exactly. And that sense of responsibility, that idea of holding ourselves accountable for our actions, it ties into another major theme in the book, the dangers of institutional power.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
And the importance of transparency.
This section is such a chilling example.
Right, this rogue group within the Swedish security service.
It shows how easily institutions can be corrupted.
Right, they're operating outside the law, prioritizing self-preservation over justice.
It's a classic case of power corrupting, and absolute power corrupting, absolutely.
Right, it exposes that dark underbelly of not just government agencies, but also the police, the courts, the psychiatric system.
The guardianship agency. It's everywhere.
It's a sobering reality.
It is.
And it makes you question, how do we hold these institutions accountable?
Right. We can't just blindly trust them.
Right. We need to be informed, vigilant, and willing to speak out against injustice.
Exactly. And that brings us back to something we've touched on throughout this deep dive.
Gossip.
Oh, gossip. It's often seen as this frivolous thing.
Yeah, malicious even.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
But the book presents it as something that can be both destructive and liberating.
It's a double-edged sword for sure. Right. It can be used to spread lies, to ruin reputations, to protect those who are guilty of wrongdoing.
But it can also be used to uncover the truth, to reveal hidden agendas, to spark movements for change.
It can give a voice to those who are marginalized.
It's a powerful tool. And like any tool, it can be used for good or evil.
Right. And it's a reminder that we need to be really discerning, especially in this age of social media.
Absolutely. We can't just believe everything we read.
Right, exactly.
We have to think critically.
Right. We have to consider the source.
Motivations behind the information.
Right. And in a way, Lisbeth embodies this whole struggle to navigate those complexities.
It does. She's this incredibly complex character.
Right. She's a hacker, a vigilante, a woman who defies expectations and refuses to be silenced.
She's a force of nature. And I think that's why she resonates so deeply with readers.
Yeah, I agree.
She's flawed, she's messy, but she's also incredibly strong and independent.
And she challenges us, right?
She does. She challenges us to confront those uncomfortable truths about ourselves and about the world.
Right, exactly.
To question our assumptions.
Right.
To think critically about the systems we live in.
Okay, so that wraps up our deep dive into the Millennium Trilogy and all the philosophy behind it.
It's been quite a journey.
It has. We've explored so many different layers.
We've talked about power, justice, individual freedom, the ethics of hacking, the nature of revenge.
Right. If you're anything like me, you're probably adding some philosophy books to your reading list.
And maybe even considering a Millennium Trilogy reread.
Right. But most importantly, keep those critical thinking skills sharp.
Exactly. Question everything. Seek out diverse perspectives. And never stop exploring.
And remember, the most important deep dives are the ones we take into our own minds.
To examine our own beliefs.
Right. To really understand our role in shaping a more just and compassionate world.
Beautifully said.
Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.